Hello, friends, and welcome back to episode 3 of You and Youth, a podcast for parents seeking to raise their kids in a complex world with a faith that can keep up. And today we're joined by the Reverend Dr. Peter Wiley, the official title. We got to get Reverend and Doctor in there, get those titles working for him. How are you doing today?
I'm great.
Awesome. Thank you for joining us today. I appreciate it.
It's good to be a part of it.
It's great to be a part of it. We love having you, and we're really excited to talk today about our denomination, the United Church of Christ. So we're going to jump in quick and just start with the question we ask everybody that comes on this show. Since it is a youth ministry-oriented podcast, we want to hear, what was your youth ministry experience growing up, if you had one?
Sure. I was raised with the assumption of church. Church for me was much like, do you go to school? Do you go to third grade? You just did it.
Yeah.
And it also was a place that I felt totally at home. We would explore the building, a large church building, and made it our home without a question. Then when it came to youth ministry, I stayed with youth ministry through early high school, and then I drifted away. But it was a place that was formative for me and mattered as I started to reshape my understanding of faith that really became something quite different than it was in childhood, where for me, childhood really was a God that you were supposed to watch out for and to be feared. And in youth ministry, I began to transform from that, but it really wasn't until I was well into college that changed dramatically.
I see. So did you grow up in the United Church of Christ, or were you in a different denomination?
I was baptized and raised in the Presbyterian Church.
Okay.
And I was in care of the Presbyterian Church when I went to seminary in Connecticut. And it was while I was in seminary that I made the leap over to the United Church of Christ.
So what kind of made you make that leap?
It's looking back on it, it may not have been as well thought out as I assumed it was back then. I still believe in the rightness of it, but at that time I was frustrated with some of the positions that the Presbyterian Church was taking. Their seminaries had stances, some of them on things that you must sign off on that you absolutely agree to. And the United Church of Christ, and some of its freedom of thought and its encouragement for people really to explore faith, drew me in that direction. I was actually discouraged by the person who became my advisor in care in the United Church of Christ to maybe not do it, because there's such independence in the United Church of Christ. And his suggestion was, you have a denomination that's looking out for you in other settings. My thinking then, and I still do believe it, if there's a problem and you need that looking out for, I thought, well, maybe it would be time to move on anyhow.
Awesome. I appreciate that. So what, can you take a moment and describe kind of the United Church of Christ's identity and maybe give some historical background on the denomination?
Often when people think about denominational discussions, it sounds like a really boring subject. And the United Church of Christ has some really exciting pieces in its history. For me, the biggest piece of the United Church of Christ that I cling to is the largest part of its roots is in the Congregationalists. And the Congregationalists who, of course, broad stroke, there were other pieces to their root in getting here, but you think about the Pilgrims who came over and to what was then thought of as New England, and they formed all those little churches on every town green. And the why and how, and it's a part of the other, and to do with the Reformation or the Protestant movement. And I love the idea of the Protestant movement is, people think of Protestant as what? As an against. And that's not the roots of that word at all, that it's a testifying for, a bringing back to the original roots, the reformation of the earliest sense of the church as really was guided by Jesus. And that's what they were seeking to do. And some of the concerns of the abuses of different churches, in particular for the Pilgrims, some of the Church of England at the time, and they wanted that freedom, the also belief in each individual having the full ability to read and understand Scripture, and that they didn't need to go through an intermediary to get to God, each person with a direct relationship with God. And that's some of the earliest pieces of at least Congregationalism. And then they came here, and each congregation believed to be true church unto itself. and not dictated to by other churches, even though in relationship with others. That obviously is a huge piece of the stream that's continued in the formation of the United Church of Christ. The Congregationalists in the 1930s joining with the Christian Church, and then at the same time the Evangelical Synod joining with the Reformed Church of America to form the ENR in a time of ecumenism. And then finally in 1957, the formation of the United Church of Christ.
Awesome. Yeah. So it's an incredible history. And for those of you who are listening today, I would recommend that you go do some of your own research on it, because it is such a long history from, I grew up in one of those churches that you referred to, one of those historic churches in Connecticut that is verging on 350 years of existence. And, it's amazing the history that is a part of this story, but also how relatively new the denomination as we know it is, too. Can you speak a little bit to that more recent history from, I think it was 1957 that we were formed?
In 1957, the Congregational Christians had their national meeting in Cleveland, just up the street, and so did the ENR. And they had it in the same week with, they'd been a long discussion in a time of ecumenism, and they both voted to form the United Church of Christ. In fact, the two presidents of the denominations actually went across the street to see each other in the midst of that vote. And when the ENR voted to become a part of the United Church of Christ, pretty much in that moment, all the churches that were ENR became a part of the United Church of Christ. And this is another piece of the history that to me is pretty amazing, is when the Congregational Christians voted to become a part of the United Church of Christ, none of the congregations were a part of the United Church of Christ because of the autonomy of each church. Every single congregation needed to either vote or not vote to become a part of the UCC. Some still haven't voted to this day. Some took many years. The church that we're in here took about 4 or 5 years. The church I served in Connecticut last before here voted 4 times until they finally ended up joining. And in the process of that, there was a group that did not want to join, and they finally gave up. And they said, it's going to happen. So what did? They went and formed another church. So here in this effort to unite, which is the premise of the United Church of Christ, is to be a united and uniting church, we form many other churches too.
That seems to be the historic trend with the Christian churches from the Protestant movement. They kept splitting and splitting and splitting. That independent ability, the ability to think for oneself, I think, is such an important thing in faith too. So when you say, I want to help kind of clarify for some who may not know, you mentioned the term ENR. Can you speak to a little bit what you mean by that and what kind of the distinctions of that thread are?
Sure. The Evangelical and Reformed Church, two separate branches that really come more from a higher liturgical background, more from a Lutheran background than the Congregational Christians, who are Zwingli and Calvin so inform them, more in line with the Presbyterians. So again, there is a diversity certainly within the denomination, and it can especially be seen in the sanctuaries that were built prior to the uniting of those two denominations.
Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned diversity, and in a lot of the United Church of Christ churches that I've seen today, it ends up that there's a lot of people in these churches that come from a variety of faith backgrounds. So I was curious, why do you think it is that the UCC churches end up being landing places for people that are looking for something different? Maybe they haven't, maybe they're coming from a church, or they haven't been churched before.
I think there are a couple of reasons. One is that in the United Church of Christ, there is that idea of stripping away a lot of the things that sometimes get in the way for people. And you go back to the earliest days of the Congregationalists, and they came over and they built meeting houses, and there was a reason why they built meeting houses and not sanctuaries. They didn't want to build things that would become idols or things that people worship the things. So they built these simple barn-like structures, dirt floors, no heat in them, absolutely no symbols. Lots of churches still don't even have a cross inside their meeting house. In time, of course, that changed. They started deciding that they needed to give more elegance to their sanctuaries. Those old meeting houses, when they first tried to protect the outside of those clapboard wood buildings, they actually painted them in milk. It was one of the easiest ways to preserve wood early on. But then, you're from New England, you know this. What color were most of those churches?
Most of them are white.
Right, and people think, why white? And we think, well, it's simplicity. But that's not true. The reason they went to white is at a time when some towns became wealthier and wealthier, the wealthiest residents of the town, their houses were white because it was the most expensive paint. Not the cheapest paint, because it was harder to remove the pigments. So they wanted to give the honor to those churches, and they painted them white. So it's not as if we've got a purity in some of our roots. Sure. I want to share just a quick story, too, that I think is just a fascinating one that's from Litchfield, Connecticut. Back in the early 1800s, Lyman Beecher was the pastor there. Lyman Beecher, well known in his family, people like Harriet Beecher Stowe, a famous author. But Lyman Beecher, one of the most respected clergy people in that day, was serving the church, First Congregational Church of Litchfield. And people were tired of having to carry their little stoves to church to keep warm. And it was proposed that they bring in a wood stove to heat the whole place. And it divided the church because some people thought, this is evil. We can't have a stove in here. We will be going straight to hell. They saw it as demonic, as some people thought organs were too in their first days. So there was a huge controversy, and in that controversy, there was the pro-stove and anti-stove. Finally, they took a vote, and who won? The pro-stove. They ordered a stove, and then one Sunday in the winter, people arrived at the church, and they looked, and there's the new stove, and the anti-stove men were loosening their collars, women fanning themselves who were the anti-stove people, and they sat down, and Lyman got up in the pulpit and said, as you can all see, we've got our new wood stove, and next week we're going to light it. Now, I just think that's such a great story and how we can get fixated on things instead of trying to go to the purity of faith. So you ask, why do we become a landing place for a lot of people of other churches and denominations? It's not because we get it perfect. But there is that freedom of thought. There's that ability not to be stuck in a creedal church that you must adhere to exact pieces and parts. And people who have felt put off by issues that they've struggled with in some other churches, it becomes a landing ground. We also have people who leave our churches because they're troubled by it too.
Yeah. Thank you for that. So, what can you maybe speak to a little bit more specifically the distinction of the UCC from some of these other denominations? I think of, you've spoken about the Presbyterian Church, the Lutheran Church. We here at First Church, we sit right next to the Episcopal Church, and there's a Methodist Church down the street. What kind of distinguishes us from some of these other pretty mainline, so to speak, denominations?
At least in theory, that at the center point of a church in the United Church of Christ is that it's the full focus is on the Bible, and the really little else gets in the way. That idea of just Scripture, obviously, that's not perfect in any place. There's also the importance of the autonomy of each individual church. So if a church like ours decides something, they can simply make that decision. It's in their authority to do so. That's not true of most denominations, that they do have judicatories, people in other parts of the broader church who have some authority over those decisions. It all plays out to that same idea of each individual having that direct relationship with God. The United Church of Christ also, for the mainline church, is certainly one of the most forward-thinking. It is the church that has been the first to places that lots of churches have landed in more recent years. The inclusion of the ordination of women, people of color, of people depending, regardless of sexual orientation. It was a church deeply embedded in abolition, and John Brown came out of this church. It was in this church that he declared that he was going to give his life to end slavery, a church that was deeply embedded in the Underground Railroad. And to this day, that becomes an important part of the history is how do you look at the history and say, where do we need to land today that helps us lean into that place that God calls us to next?
Awesome. So why do you think in today, 2024, that the UCC is a compelling choice for families with kids, whether they're elementary or teenagers? Why do you think it's a compelling choice to attend a UCC church?
One of the things, and again, you can't speak for all churches in any denomination, but I think we're certainly pretty representative of many. And there's the encouragement for youth to think, that not to indoctrinate, but to really wrestle with, ponder, to be honest about doubts. And that's okay. Yeah. And that we're all on that journey. I love William Sloane Coffin, one of the beloved pastors of the 70s, 80s, lead pastor of Riverside Church, chaplain at Yale. But he used to like to talk about when students would come to him and say, I don't believe in God. And he would say to them, well, tell me about the God you don't believe in, because I probably don't believe in that God too. And what a great freedom that we have, that ability, that we do believe. God wants us to ask questions, not to be fearful of doubts or wonderments. Something that I think you do beautifully in our youth ministry is to nurture youth in their questioning so that they can come to a place that has a foundation that's real and thoughtful.
I appreciate that. Yeah, I think I would have to agree with you in that the freedom of thought is not just a gimmick, so to speak. It is really truly an authentic piece. And I think, we see that a lot in our confirmation program, where I think kids come in with, I think what I learned as called embedded theology in seminary. These theological things that we bring to the table that maybe we don't actually believe in, but it's just what we've accumulated or learned over the years. And it's fun to see them be able to question those things and to maybe leave those things behind and kind of construct a faith ethic that works for them and is rooted in kind of these core values of love, of compassion for other people. I think that's, for me, having grown up in a UCC church and having stuck with the denomination, that's a thing that is really, for me, compelling, is just that we're not going to tell you or your family or anyone what or how to believe. We'll encourage you to, whatever it is the mission of the community is, but you are not supposed to check off any boxes in order to be a faithful member of one of our communities. We want you as you are, authentically.
Well, if your confirmation was anything like mine, and so many were, it really was a process that you went through of learning information, often even tested on that information. And the culmination of it, even though they said it wasn't a graduation, it really was in many ways. It's that you completed a certain set of material, proved that you had learned it, a catechism of sorts. And that really isn't what confirmation should be about. Confirmation is either you're confirming that you believe something or you don't. And I love the premise that we use here of that's the goal, is to wrestle so that at the end of that program, you're able to say, yeah, I think right now that's where my head is at, or I'm not ready for that. And it's not a saying no, but it's saying, no, I can't confirm it yet. That's a great thing.
Yeah, absolutely. So, we talked a little bit about how we do things here. I want to go micro for a minute and talk about First Church Hudson.
Sure.
What are some of the things about this faith community that maybe reflect the wider UCC, and maybe what are some things that are unique about us that maybe differ from the wider UCC?
Absolutely. Something for years now that I've played with and really appreciated is in the United Church of Christ, that many congregations have gravitated to the idea of wherever you are in your journey, you're welcome here. It's a wonderful statement, and the idea of we don't want to exclude people, but we've changed that. We have that too, but also the idea, wherever you are on your journey, we will meet you there. That there's a presumption, at least in the language of you're welcome here, that you're welcome to come and be one of us, to conform to who we are. Yeah, who you are, but come and become a part of this place, look like us, be like us. Well, to say we will meet you there is really much more faithful way of following Jesus. And what Jesus did is Jesus went to where people were, understood them in their full being, affirmed them in their full humanity. And especially in this broken day in which we live, like most are, to say we need to understand you, where you came from, what you're about, what drives you, what's formed you, and why you think the things you do. And that when we do that, we're likely to find that same spark that God sees in that person. And to be able to say, yeah, where you are is a beautiful thing too. That's become a central element for who we are. That's what we're seeking to do to follow Jesus, while confessing we're going to blow it. We're going to mess up along the way. As much as we want to meet people where they are, that's what we're trying to do. But if we start thinking we've arrived, we've failed. So that's played out in so many ways within the church and also outside, as we've put such an emphasis on our first serve efforts, which reach into the nearby city of Akron. And how is it we meet people, especially one day a year, but then throughout the year, and form those relationships where we break down those barriers. It's why we're in the process of accepting the gift of a church in Akron that will be a center to be able to do that as well.
That's awesome. Well, I appreciate your time today. One final thing, and I didn't prep you on this one. If you had a message for the youth and their parents today, what would it be, and what kind of message would you want a parent or a youth to be taking away from a faith community today?
It's so often the stereotype of Christian churches are places that are not fun, are not happy, are judgmental, are smugly self-righteous, and that's all wrong. That's not what Jesus did. Jesus did one thing primarily, is reached out in love to each and every person. So if there's one thing that I would hope our youth, our parents, everybody heard, is that you are loved. You are valued. You are a child of God. You deserve that love and care just like you are, period, no matter what. And if we fail to try to do that, then we failed in the most fundamental element of what it means to be a person of the Christian faith. So if you hear nothing else, I hope those who listen will hear, no matter what's happening in your life, never forget that you're loved.
Well, and on that note, thank you for being here, Peter. We really appreciate your time today and all of the wisdom and the information that you've shared with us. And friends, thank you for listening. Or if you're watching on YouTube, thanks for watching today. This has been episode 3 of the You and Youth podcast. If you have not yet done so, please like, subscribe on YouTube, rate the podcast on whatever platform you're listening to it today, and share it with your friends too. Word of mouth is the best way to get the word out to other people who may find this show a benefit to them in their faith journey. And if you want to support the podcast too, you can go online to hudsonucc.org/podcasts to find different ways to engage with us. There's our mailbag link on there where you can help drive the content of this show, as well as a link to our merch store where you can buy a shirt. If you're on YouTube and watching this, you can see the shirt that I'm wearing today. You can buy that and some other styles too on that website there, and a portion of those proceeds go to help fund our podcast efforts here. So friends, thank you so much for joining us, and we will see you next time.